My manager ignored my request for a raise for 8 months. The request was backed by hard data from 11 years of work. When 2 juniors I trained were both promoted, I quietly left, taking the company's 2 largest accounts with me. I, 34F, thought I knew what loyalty meant until my manager taught me otherwise. 11 years. That's how long I'd been grinding at Morrison & Associates, watching the company grow from a mid-sized consulting firm to an industry leader. I'd been there since the beginning of their expansion, back when we operated out of 2 cramped floors and everyone knew everyone's coffee order. Now we occupied an entire building downtown, and I barely recognized half the faces in the elevator. My cubicle sat in the corner of the 3rd floor, strategically positioned where I could see both the elevator and my manager's office. Over the years, I'd watched countless colleagues come and go, some climbing the ladder, others jumping ship for better opportunities. I'd always been the constant, the reliable one who stayed late, came in early, and never complained about the workload. The irony wasn't lost on me that my dedication had become my prison. 8 months ago, I'd finally worked up the courage to request what I knew I deserved. The preparation had taken weeks. I'd compiled every metric imaginable: client retention rates, revenue generated, projects completed, overtime hours logged, certifications earned. The numbers painted a clear picture of someone who'd outgrown their position years ago. My manager had listened with the kind of polite attention you give a child explaining their drawing. He'd nodded at appropriate intervals, made non-committal sounds, and promised to review everything with upper management. That was in October. By June, I'd followed up 7 times, each inquiry met with the same rehearsed response about budget constraints and timing. Meanwhile, the 2 junior associates I'd personally trained were called into his office on a Tuesday morning. They emerged an hour later with promotion letters and salary bumps that exceeded what I'd been requesting. The younger one couldn't contain her excitement, practically bouncing as she shared the news. The other one had the decency to look embarrassed when he told me, but not embarrassed enough to turn down the opportunity. I congratulated them both with a smile that felt like swallowing glass. That afternoon, I sat in my car during lunch break, staring at the company building through my windshield. The rage had settled into something colder, more calculating. I'd spent 11 years building relationships, understanding systems, becoming indispensable. What I hadn't realized was that being indispensable meant being taken for granted. The Hartwell account had been my baby for 6 years. When I'd inherited it, they were considering dropping our services due to poor communication and missed deadlines. I'd turned that relationship around, growing their annual contract from $180,000 to $2.3 million. The account manager they'd assigned was technically my superior, but everyone knew I was the one keeping Hartwell happy. The Meridian Group was even more personal. I'd landed them myself 3 years ago, cold calling their CEO after researching their expansion plans for months. That relationship had grown into a $1.8 million annual contract, with talks of doubling it next year. Again, I did the work while someone else got the credit and the commission. Both accounts trusted me specifically. They'd made that clear in numerous emails and calls over the years. When Hartwell's CFO had compliance questions, he called me directly. When Meridian needed rush projects, they requested me by name. I'd cultivated these relationships carefully, becoming not just a service provider but a trusted advisor. Sitting in that parking lot, I realized I'd been thinking about this all wrong. I'd been asking for permission to be valued when I should have been demonstrating my worth in a language they'd understand. I spent the next 2 weeks being the perfect employee. I showed up on time, completed my assignments, attended meetings with my usual professionalism. But I was also making phone calls. Quiet conversations with former colleagues who'd started their own firms. Lunch meetings disguised as personal catch-ups. Late-night research sessions on business licenses and client acquisition strategies. The plan crystallized when I discovered that my non-compete clause had a glaring loophole. It prevented me from directly soliciting clients for 6 months, but it said nothing about clients choosing to follow me if I started my own consultancy. The distinction was subtle but legally significant. I registered my LLC on a Friday afternoon, using my maiden name to avoid immediate detection. The paperwork was surprisingly straightforward, and within a week, I had business cards, a professional website, and a small office space in a shared workspace across town. The hardest part was the waiting. I needed to time everything perfectly. Too early, and the company might have time to salvage the relationships. Too late, and I'd lose momentum. I decided to give my notice on a Monday, effective immediately, citing personal reasons that required my immediate attention. My manager's reaction was predictably dismissive. He barely looked up from his computer when I handed him the resignation letter, muttering something about giving 2 weeks' notice being standard practice. I explained that my circumstances didn't allow for a transition period, and he shrugged as if my departure was merely an inconvenience. The next morning, I was in my new office when my phone rang. Hartwell's CFO was calling to discuss the quarterly review meeting scheduled for the following week. I explained that I was no longer with Morrison and Associates but would be happy to continue supporting their needs through my new consultancy. The conversation was brief but positive. He asked me to send over my new contact information and mentioned that they'd been concerned about some recent communication gaps with the Morrison team. Meridian's response was even more enthusiastic. Their CEO had been frustrated with what he perceived as decreased attention to their account over the past few months. When I explained my situation, he immediately asked about transitioning their contract to my new firm. The process would take a few weeks to navigate the legal requirements, but he assured me they wanted to maintain our working relationship. By Wednesday, both clients had formally notified Morrison and Associates of their intent to terminate their contracts. The reasons cited were standard business language about changing needs and strategic direction, but the timing wasn't coincidental. My former manager called me Thursday morning, his tone significantly different from our last conversation. He wanted to understand what had happened, whether there was anything the company could do to resolve the situation. I explained that my clients had made independent business decisions based on their own needs and preferences. There was nothing to resolve. He mentioned that upper management was now interested in discussing my compensation concerns. The irony was almost amusing. 8 months of documented requests had been ignored, but losing $4.1 million in annual revenue had suddenly made my contributions visible. I thanked him for the belated interest but explained that I was committed to my new venture. The conversation ended awkwardly, with him suggesting that my actions might have legal implications. I assured him that I'd been careful to operate within all contractual boundaries and wished him well. The following week brought a flurry of activity. Lawyers from Morrison and Associates requested meetings to discuss the client transitions. I referred them to my attorney, who confirmed that everything had been handled appropriately. The clients had made their own decisions, and I hadn't violated any non-compete provisions. What surprised me was the response from other colleagues. Several reached out privately to congratulate me, sharing their own frustrations with the company's management practices. 2 mentioned that they were considering similar moves, having watched my situation unfold over the past months. The junior associates I'd trained were notably quiet. The one who'd been excited about her promotion seemed uncomfortable whenever we crossed paths during the transition meetings. The other one actually apologized, saying he hadn't realized how long I'd been waiting for recognition. I appreciated the gesture, but it didn't change anything. Update 1. 3 weeks after my departure, the ripple effects were becoming clear. Morrison and Associates had to scramble to replace not just my work output, but the institutional knowledge I'd accumulated over 11 years. The Hartwell transition revealed gaps in their documentation and process management that I'd been quietly filling for years. My former manager was reassigned to a different department, though I heard through the grapevine that it wasn't entirely voluntary. The company had hired a consulting firm to review their employee retention practices, which struck me as both ironic and overdue. My new business was growing faster than I'd anticipated. Both major clients were thrilled with the personalized attention they were receiving, and word was spreading through their networks. I'd already fielded inquiries from 3 potential new clients, all referrals from satisfied customers. The financial impact was significant. My first quarter revenue projections exceeded what I'd been earning annually at Morrison and Associates, even after accounting for business expenses and taxes. More importantly, I was working with clients who valued my expertise and paid accordingly. Update 2. 6 months later, the transformation was complete. My consultancy had grown to include 2 part-time contractors and was operating at full capacity. The Hartwell account had expanded beyond our original scope, and Meridian had indeed doubled their contract as anticipated. Morrison and Associates had struggled to replace the lost revenue. They'd managed to sign a few smaller clients, but nothing approaching the scale of what they'd lost. Industry contacts mentioned that they were having difficulty with client retention across other accounts as well, suggesting that my departure had exposed broader systemic issues. The most satisfying development came when I received a LinkedIn message from the junior associate who'd gotten my promotion. She was leaving Morrison and Associates and wondered if I had any opportunities available. The message was carefully worded, but the subtext was clear. The promotion hadn't led to the career growth she'd expected, and the company's culture hadn't improved. I offered her a contract position on a project basis, which allowed her to transition gradually while maintaining her income. She proved to be as capable as I'd always believed, and having trained her myself, the integration was seamless. Update 3. A year after leaving Morrison and Associates, I received an unexpected call from their new management. The company had undergone significant restructuring, including bringing in outside leadership to address their retention and growth challenges. They wanted to discuss the possibility of a partnership arrangement, potentially bringing my consultancy back into their network as an independent contractor. The conversation was professional and respectful, acknowledging the mistakes that had led to my departure. They offered terms that would have been attractive a year earlier: flexible scheduling, premium rates, and guaranteed minimum revenue. But I'd moved beyond needing their validation or their platform. I declined politely, explaining that my business had evolved in directions that made such partnerships impractical. The truth was simpler. I'd learned that my value wasn't determined by their recognition of it. The market had provided that validation more clearly than any performance review ever could. My former manager, I learned, had left the company entirely and was working for a smaller firm in a different city. The junior associates had both moved on as well, one to a competitor and the other to an in-house position with a former client. The department I'd worked in for 11 years had been completely restructured, with most of the institutional knowledge I'd helped build scattered to the winds. The lesson wasn't about revenge, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't satisfaction in watching the consequences unfold. It was about understanding that loyalty is a two-way street, and that sometimes the most professional response to being undervalued is to let the market demonstrate your worth. Today, when young professionals ask me for career advice, I tell them what I wish someone had told me years earlier. Document your contributions, know your value, and never be afraid to take it with you when you leave. Companies will always prioritize their interests over yours, and there's nothing wrong with doing the same. The best part isn't the money or the independence, though both are significant improvements. It's the knowledge that I'm finally being compensated fairly for work I genuinely enjoy, with clients who appreciate what I bring to their businesses. After 11 years of asking for recognition, I'd finally learned to recognize my own worth. Sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is simply walking away.